I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our luncheon plenary speaker. Jared Huffman is an assembly member from the 6th Assembly District, representing Sonoma and Marin counties. Has an interesting career evolution to the legislature. He is, by my way of thinking, the first environmental professional in the history of the California legislature to be elected to the California legislature. And perhaps recognizing the talent with which he was blessed with Jared's election, Speaker Nunez quickly appointed him as a freshman legislator as chair of the Assembly Committee on Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials. But I must confess, in preparing to introduce Assemblymember Huffman, I was most delighted to see that, with all due respect to the University of California at Berkeley, that we share one common trait. We both went to, got our undergraduate degrees from that other institution of higher learning that is stellar, the University of California at Santa Barbara, where...
I thought you meant Stanford.
No, not that one. That would be too dangerous in this crowd and in this region. And also a very distinguished athletic career while in college and thereafter. So without further ado, I give you Assemblymember Jared Huffman.
Well, thanks everybody. It's great to be here at Bolt Hall. Are we in Bolt Hall? This is it. I've only been here a couple of times, and I get lost every time I come on the UC Berkeley campus, so I apologize that I'm late, and I thank you for your patience. I understand we have a mixed group that includes some law students sort of thinking about their future. How many law students are in the group? Interesting, okay. Well, I remember when I was in your shoes, and there's so much possibility ahead of you, and you're wondering where to take your career, and I can only say I hope you are as happy as I thought I would be. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. There's a lot of good work to do in the years ahead, and I'm sure you'll have a role in it. I was asked to speak a little bit about the interesting path that led me to be a state legislator as part of my remarks, and so I will lay that out for you to prove that that really green environmentalists can actually become elected officials, which some people still question. And then I also want to speak to you about two parts of my background that have really come into play and I think will continue to be important as we go forward and wrestle with this challenge of climate change. And it is my environmental background, and in particular my water background. Because if you haven't heard already from Peter Glick and others, I think water is going to be one of the critical areas that maybe the public hasn't quite focused on, but a critical area for helping us meet our AB 32 challenges and tackling global warming, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but also the need to adapt to greenhouse gas, to global warming comes into play in a big way when we talk about water. So how did I get here? Well, honestly, I never had a blueprint for becoming an elected official or a legislator. I graduated law school, took a job at a large firm, and didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I just knew that I was going to sort of follow my interests and see where it went. And as I look back, sitting here as a legislator, I can sort of answer the question, why did it work? Certainly at the time, this wasn't where I was trying to go. But I think one of the reasons it worked is because I got civically involved. I found interests that were public interest causes that I cared about, and I followed them, and they led to good places. And in my case, the first of those was civil rights and gender equity. As a pro bono attorney at a large firm, I took on some Title IX cases, was able to represent some women's sports teams and coaches, and fight off some discriminatory practices by universities around the state, and that got me into the world of civil rights and public interest law. So I left my large law firm job and opened my own door, and soon was taking on all sorts of civil rights and also environmental causes. And then in my part-time, I found myself drawn to run for public office for the Marin Municipal Water District Board. Kind of a backwater politically, but water's an interesting subject. And I ended up spending 12 years on the Water District Board in Marin, where I not only learned about all aspects of urban water management, and conservation and recycling, but also about fishery restoration, because in Marin, most of the water supply comes from 7 dams on the Lagunitas Creek system, happens to be home to the largest remaining coho salmon population in California. So I got very involved in Endangered Species Act issues, in water rights issues, and just the host of fishery restoration issues. And that interest ultimately led me to change careers and go to work for a large environmental group, NRDC. Where I worked with Dr. Hanneman, who I see in the back of the room, on a huge and historic case to restore the San Joaquin River. The San Joaquin River is California's second largest river, had been completely dried up by Friant Dam for 60 years. The largest salmon run, one of the largest salmon runs on the whole Pacific coast, was extinguished. It's contributed to a lot of the problems that we're experiencing even today in the Delta with the collapse of that ecosystem. But after about 18 years of litigation, and I was part of about 6 years of that at NRDC, we ultimately settled with the irrigation districts and the federal government, and are even now in the middle of implementing that historic settlement. So a very exciting case, a very exciting job with an environmental group that was working on climate change in a big way, and in fact was very active in the drafting and the passing of AB 32. So I absorbed an awful lot of that while being part of that organization. And in 2006, I had begun in my capacity as an NRDC attorney to work in the Capitol and to witness this amazing depletion of talent that term limits was bringing to the place. I was watching people like Byron Scher get termed out and be handed lifetime achievement awards by all the environmental groups and wished well, and he had a lot of good work left in him. I mean, he had certainly been doing great things for several decades, but he was by no means done. I watched Fran Pavley herself, the author of AB 32 and other great environmental laws, head out of the legislature because of term limits, and the list goes on and on. And right at that time, the assembly seat in my district in Marin and Sonoma came open, and so as somebody who'd spent 12 years by then as an elected official and kind of had a novel story to tell as a professional environmentalist, I decided to run. And you probably couldn't get away with running as a professional environmentalist everywhere in the state. If you tried it in Kern County, you'd be taking your life in your hands. But in Marin County, putting Sierra Club endorses and things like that on your literature and your signs and going everywhere and proclaiming all your environmental credentials is a very smart thing to do. And in a crowded field of 6 candidates, it worked out very nicely for me. That was about the entirety of my political support was the environmental community. But in Marin and Sonoma, that worked pretty well, and here I am. So I'm in the legislature at a very interesting time because, as you know, the rubber's starting to meet the road when it comes to AB 32. The Air Board right now is putting the finishing touches on a draft scoping plan that we'll see in the months ahead. And we've had some oversight hearings in the legislature to try to get a preview into what that plan is going to offer. And particularly, what are they going to do on the really hard issues? What sectors are going to be identified for hard emission caps? What kind of market mechanisms are going to be used? What kind of command and control regulation will we see? And this is really going to be hugely controversial because AB 32 didn't resolve all that. It really handed it to the Air Board and I think quite wisely put it in their hands to be decided after very careful deliberation. But the deadlines are coming. That plan has got to be rolled out by the end of this year. I don't think they have yet resolved some of these tough questions. And from the oversight hearing we had a few weeks ago, it's clear to me that what we're likely to see in the draft in July is really a menu of possibilities and not a draft plan as we might expect from terms like that. So the stakes will only get higher as the year goes on. The one thing that we have seen pretty clearly, though, is that water is going to feature prominently in AB 32 implementation. If you add up all of the electricity, which is about 19% of our electrical use has to do some way or another with our water use, 32% of our non-electrical generating natural gas use involves our water supplies. So all of the natural gas that we burn to heat water around the state, for example. And everyone probably knows that California has the most elaborate and far-flung water system on the planet Earth. We take water from Mount Shasta and we pump it all the way down over the Tehachapis and further south all the way to San Diego. And nobody anywhere else on Earth has done anything quite that ambitious. It uses a huge amount of energy. And that's just really the beginning of the complexity when it comes to this intersection of water and climate change, because we can say water's a place where we need to reduce electrical use, where we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by promoting things that are less energy intensive and cleaner energy supplies, because the State Water Project uses some of the dirtiest power in the state. But the other side of that is water is one of the more uniquely vulnerable parts of our economy, of our society, when it comes to the impacts of climate change, when we depend so heavily on the hydrology as we've come to know it, on the snowpack, on the weather patterns. You can see that water is a very delicate proposition, even from slight changes in our weather patterns. And increased temperature is going to affect us too, because evapotranspiration rates will go up. And so we can expect to see higher demands for water when it comes to both urban and agricultural irrigation. So I'm just really excited to bring a strong interest and a strong background in water to this issue that I think all of us are realizing is kind of the defining environmental issue of our time, climate change, because the two are intersecting in a really big way. It's not made any easier by the fact that the delta is in complete collapse, and so the system that provides 23 million Californians with at least some part of their drinking water is going to have to be fundamentally reconsidered and reconfigured. And there are no easy answers when it comes to that. We certainly have a lot of folks that are trotting out the same agendas they've been pushing for many years and trying to wrap them in global warming and climate change, and say we need these dams that we used to pitch for other reasons now to fight global warming, or we need a peripheral canal that we used to want for water quality or some other reason for global warming. So we have to look very carefully at things like that. And I think the other thing we have to be very careful about, I was reading a column last week by a newspaper columnist in the Sacramento Bee. And this is pretty typical of the stuff you read these days. And when talking about the water crisis, he says we have to get back to what we did in the late 1950s when Harvey Banks, who was the state engineer that promoted the State Water Project, said, now's the time to build and we'll ask questions later. A lot of folks think that, getting back to that mentality, just mustering up the political will to build something really, really big must be the answer to this solution. And I personally believe that we ought to, the complexities of climate change as well as common sense dictate a bit of a more careful response than that. In Marin County, I know that from personal experience, because coming out of the drought of the 1970s, it was a short drought, 76, 77, but a very deep one. Marin County almost ran out of water. We literally had to string a pipe across the Richmond Bridge and beg for water from the Metropolitan Water District of Los Angeles. So lots of ironies there. And coming out of that deep drought, Marin County built a reservoir out in West Marin called Sulahuli. And that's something people wanted at the time. We got to have more surface storage because we don't ever want to run out of water again. Well, 30 years later, we've used the water from that dam all of twice, and very little water when we did use it, because it doesn't store enough carryover storage to be of much good in really dry years when it's needed, and in wet years it's too far away and isn't economical enough to use because there are other supplies closer to the treatment plants. So, it's sitting there amortizing, and it'll be paid off in a few more years. A complete boondoggle. And I would urge all of you, as we try to tackle this water challenge and the delta, to beware of Sulahuli-like solutions. That's the name of that project, Sulahuli. And one of the projects that the governor is pushing in particular, Sites Reservoir. If you think about it, north of Delta, off-stream storage, We still don't know how we're going to get water through the delta. We don't even know if a peripheral canal of some kind can be operated in a way that insulates it from all of these vulnerabilities that climate change brings with it. We don't know that a diversion of the massive size that's been proposed can be operated without presenting huge new environmental problems, and it's all being proposed in sensitive salmon habitat. This is all on the salmon migratory routes, and our salmon stocks are crashing. So if you're talking about spending a few $1 billion on a big bucket north of the delta, you better be right in your assumption that we're going to find a way to move all that water through or around the delta, because if you're not, you're going to have something a lot like Marin County has right now in Sulahuli, a big facility sitting out there amortizing and not doing anyone much good. So those are kind of my unscripted thoughts about how I got into my job, how the issues that I care a lot about these days, climate change and water, are beginning to intersect in some very interesting ways. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Any questions for the Assembly member? If you want to come down to the microphone so we can pick you up for posterity.
What are your views on the sort of command and control regulation versus cap and trade market-based approaches? I know that there was a lot of talk about that at the Oversight Committee that happened a few weeks ago. And then just your thoughts on the new discussion about nuclear.
Nuclear, okay. Well, first, my thoughts are about command and control versus market mechanisms. I see a role for market mechanisms, but I think too often these things are discussed as alternatives of each other and not sort of essential components of a comprehensive scheme. If we allow cap and trade, there's no way it's going to work unless it's heavily regulated. And if we allow offsets and other market mechanisms, I don't think we can be sure we actually get the emission reductions unless we heavily regulate them, unless we, in my opinion, probably limit them to things right here in California. Because one of the things AB 32 requires is that that be enforceable and verifiable and not things that were going to happen anyway. And I just don't see how we verify that here in California if we're allegedly preventing deforestation in Indonesia and calling that an offset that we grant to a California emitter. So, I guess I'm skeptical of the full-blown market solution. I think we've seen in Europe and in some other instances that a free market approach without the right regulations and without the right constraints doesn't work. But I do see the benefit of finding the fastest and the most efficient emission reductions, and I think things like cap and trade, if they're done right, can help get us there. Part of the doing it right really has to involve some sensitivity to disadvantaged communities that have been adversely impacted by some of these stationary sources that have been polluting for many years. And hopefully we can find a way to address their concerns so we get the reinvestment in those spots and enjoy the co-benefits of jobs and public health benefits while we're getting those emission reductions. But not an easy balance to strike. And then nuclear is what you asked about. Realistically, we're not going to see any nuclear in California for a long time. The voters passed an initiative that bans the siting of nuclear power plants until we can come up with an answer on long-term disposal of waste, and we're no closer to long-term disposal of waste than we were when that initiative was put into law. So we've had a few token efforts to revive that and run a counter-initiative, and it got nowhere, couldn't even gather the signatures. So it's sort of an interesting hypothetical out there, but I don't see nuclear playing any kind of a role here in California.
We have time for one more question. Steve.
You mentioned interest in the embedded energy and water issue, and I'm curious as to what your thoughts are for strategies to try to remove some of that energy from the water, and also where you think the legislature might fit into the picture.
Well, there's some very exciting strategies that we're talking about right now, maybe the biggest of which is borrowing from what the PUC has done in the world of energy, where they've established a loading order of how we're going to meet future energy demands. And it starts with efficiency, then it goes to renewables, and then it goes to clean energy, such as the cleanest combined cycle natural gas, and with the advent of a law we passed a couple years ago, that's about where it ends. We can't bring any new supplies on that are any dirtier than the combined cycle natural gas plants. So, taking that over to the world of water, I think everyone agrees that water use efficiency is the place you start. It's the cheapest, fastest, and the solution with the most benefits, and certainly for greenhouse gas reduction, the most benefits. Recycling is a second item that we want to promote, because it not only will help offset potable supply and therefore reduce the need for both the generation of that water supply and the treatment of the water supply to the potable level, but you don't have to transport it. You can treat it and use it very close to where the demand center is. So recycling is great. The Air Board is focusing on conservation and recycling in a big way in its early action items, and in the preliminary documents we're starting to see associated with the scoping plan. Then it gets a little more interesting after conservation and recycling. Because there are some communities, and I would submit Marin is one, where they have done just about everything you would ask them to do reasonably on water use efficiency and recycling. When we take this big statewide snapshot, and the Pacific Institute's done a great job, Peter Glick and others, at looking at our big picture potential, you sort of look at the fact that some places in the state still aren't even metered for water. Fresno's still kind of bringing that technology online. Other places haven't offered the most basic incentives like tiered rate structures and volumetric billing for water. You go further down that continuum of measures, and some places haven't yet offered financial incentives to retrofit low efficiency toilets. And there's just all sorts of things that you add them all up, and there's millions of acre feet statewide to be saved. But Marin County's been doing it for decades and has the most steeply inclined rate structure, or one or two of the most steeply inclined rate structures you'll find in the state. They are running incentives for water conservation right now at the tune of $800 an acre foot. I would dare you to find somebody in the country that's paying $800 an acre foot for people to conserve water. So they are so advanced in the baseline from which they start that applying a one-size-fits-all loading order to them is going to be tough. So it needs to be flexible enough to, I think, to recognize that people start from different places. And in Marin County, they gave up 15% of their supply to a fisheries order that's doing good things in Lagunitas Creek, but has certainly made it tougher on the water supply. So options like desalination, I think, are going to need to be in the mix, even though it uses more energy right now. And that's, again, getting back to that complicating factor with water. We have to reduce greenhouse gases, but we have to provide reliability to adapt to the variations we're going to see going forward in our climate.
Two comments on Assemblyman Huffman. To underscore the substance that he brings to his position, I want you to know, standing here, I was impressed that he was able to give a very substantive presentation with nary a note. And the last person I saw do that with equal aplomb when he was an appellate litigator was one John Roberts before he got appointed to run the federal judiciary. So that's good company to keep. The other thing is that he not only talks the talk, he walks the walk. I met Jared at the curb, and he rolled up not in his Lincoln Town car, but rather in a Toyota hybrid. So well done. Anyway, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for a most thoughtful presentation.